Professor PLO Lumumba is the founder of the PLO Lumumba Foundation and a consultant with Lumumba and Lumumba Advocates, who are members of the Africa Justice Group. He is a member of the Kenya Institute of Certified Public Secretaries, the Kenya Institute of Management, and the African Academy of Sciences as an honorary fellow. He is the chairman of the Farafina Investment Group in Liberia and the Economic Strategic Growth and Development Initiative for Africa in Nigeria. He has authored several books on diverse subjects, with several speeches on various topics delivered in and outside Africa. Lumumba is recognized as one of the leading public speakers in Africa and the African in diaspora. He has also been twice recognized as one of the 100 most influential Africans. And now, ladies and gentlemen, join me as I make welcome to GPAD 2021, Professor PLO Lumumba.
Thank you very much for that dramatic introduction. Thank you very much. Let me first say how glad I am to have joined a little early, because it has given me the opportunity to listen to the presentation from the young men. I've had the advantage of listening to my friend Yvonne and Faith. Your own interventions have also been very enlightening. And it comes at a time when I think Africa finds herself at crossroads. I travel across Africa quite a bit, to the south, to the west, to the center, to the east. And Africa worries me. And so worried was I that on the 4th of November this year, and this month, of course, I chose to write to all the 54 African heads of states and government. And my letter, portions of which I'll read as a part of my presentation, actually answers what you've asked me to speak about and responds to some of the issues that have been raised this morning. I start by saying my subject, of course, is the state of Africa. And what I say, I hereby make this plea to you with utmost humility that I may address you on the state of our beloved continent. Your Excellencies, at the very outset, permit me to preface my humble communication with a statement that Kwame Nkrumah made in his book, I Speak for Africa. And I proceed to quote the Osagyefo. The political situation in Africa is heartening and at the same time disturbing, he said. It is heartening to see many flags hoisted in the place of old ones. It is disturbing to see so many countries of varying sizes and at different levels of development weak and in some cases, almost helpless. If this terrible state of fragmentation is allowed to continue, it may be disastrous for all of us. That is Kwame Nkrumah speaking in 1963. Kwame spoke those words, I say, at a time when the process of decolonization was going on in earnest and when a number of countries had not regained their independence. He forewarned again, and I quote him, "The future of Africa, the modernization of Africa that has a place in the 21st century is linked with its decolonization and detribalization. Tribal atavism would be giving up hope for Africa. And of all the sins that Africa can commit, the sin of despair would be the most unforgivable." I then, in the letter, remind the leaders that I have recognized numerous efforts that have been made to make Africa great. I take them to the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, where African heads of states and governments said, Africa should trade within ourselves. I remind them of the regional efforts of ECOWAS, of SADC, of the Maghreb, of Central Africa, of East Africa, of IGAD, of COMESA, of Agenda 2063 and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. and I go to the declarations, Abuja on health, Yamoussoukro on free airspace, Kigali declaration on free movement of Africans and a single passport. I go to Maputo on the rights of women. I go to Malabo. I cite all of them. And then I say that despite all these, as Nkrumah warned on the 25th day of May 1963, in independent Africa, we are already re-experiencing the instability and frustration which existed under colonial rule. We are first learning that political independence is not enough to rid us of the consequences of colonial rule. And this is what I prescribe at the very end of my letter. Your Excellencies, in the face of these difficulties which have bedeviled us for so long and whose impact you are acutely aware of, I now appeal and beseech your leadership to urgently convene a meeting of all heads of states and government to focus on only 3 agenda items. 1, the current state of affairs in the continent. 2, the proposed short-term and long-term solutions to our predicament. And 3, the time frame within which solutions ought to be implemented. This was my letter written and has been delivered, I believe, to most African heads of states and government on the 4th day of November. And in many ways, it summarizes my pain and my agony. Why? Because as I speak to you now, and I've had occasion to listen to you, look at the state of our continent. There is conflict in Somalia. I'm starting with the Horn. There is a conflict in Ethiopia. There is a conflict in Sudan. There is low-intensity conflict in South Sudan. There is a conflict in Burkina Faso. There is some kind of tension in Guinea-Conakry, in Niger, in Eastern Congo, in Northern Mozambique, in the Cameroons, in Nigeria, there is tension. That is the state of our continent. Our health sectors are not doing well. Our agriculture is not doing well. Our minerals are being taken out in their raw form. There is a sense in which the continent is in a crisis, and we are all asking ourselves the question, how can we get out of this deep hole in which we find ourselves? Earlier presentations were characterized with some of the arguments that I've always put forth. And you will have heard my good friend Yvonne allude to them when she said English speaking. We say Anglophone. But if you ask the countries that we call Anglophone, Nigeria is supposed to be an Anglophone country. How many Nigerians speak English? Why are we called Anglophone? We say Francophone. How many people in Cote d'Ivoire or in Senegal speak French? We say Lusophone. How many Angolans speak Portuguese? But we do not define ourselves, and we talked about the African identity. And I want to once again refer to a statement that was made a while ago by John Henry Clark. Many of you will know John Henry Clark, the African-American who is considered one of the major contributors to Pan-Africanism and the whole idea of Black identity. And he talks about the African state, the post-colonial African state. And this is what we say. When we look at this African independent explosion, we must take into consideration that no one African nation came to power using a conventional African structure of government. Everyone used an imitation parliamentary procedure taken from Europe. Africa will never succeed using European parliamentary techniques. This is his verdict. And if you look at each one of these particular countries, you are seeing that this imported democracy that is crafted in Europe and panel-beaten in the United States of America is not doing as much good in the continent of Africa. And when I look at this, I also would refer you, because the subject we are talking about is not a new one, a book written by a Nigerian, Adekeye Adebayo. Adekeye Adebayo has written a book called The Curse of Berlin. And in that book, he says many things, but he said that he, like many, is often puzzled by our fidelity to the boundaries that we inherited from the colonial masters. This was a major debate in the 1960s when Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Gamal Abdel Nasser argued that these boundaries that we have inherited, they are artificial. They divided Africa arbitrarily in a manner that was designed to benefit the European colonizers, so that the Germans had their sphere of influence, the French their sphere of influence, the English their sphere of influence, the Portuguese their sphere of influence, the Italians their sphere of influence, the Belgians their sphere of influence, and of course, the Dutch their sphere of influence. That was why Berlin was convened. Berlin was convened by the European power to say, we are scrambling for this continent. We are scrambling for her resources. We are scrambling for her well-being. How can we derive benefit without being at war ourselves? This was the essence of Berlin. And when you see the conflicts that we inherited, it was because of Berlin. But I was making the point that when countries started regaining independence, their leaders who toyed with the idea as to whether we should tinker with the boundaries. And you will remember the statement of the inviolability of inherited boundaries in Addis Ababa in 1963, which was once again reinforced in Cairo in 1964. We said, let us retain them, but let us move towards a more unified Africa that will de-emphasize the significance of these boundaries. But today, we know that these boundaries are becoming a source of conflict. We know that one of the things that we experience in Africa is the difficulty to travel. Today, if I want to travel to Abuja in Nigeria, I am told, and because I have a running visa, so I don't go through that process, but a friend of mine who wanted to travel to Nigeria last week had to apply online, and after he had applied online, the payment had to be made not in Kenyan shillings, has to be made in American dollars. Compare that with an American who wants to travel to Nigeria. He or she does not need to make any application. He'll arrive at Abuja, or Muritala Mohammed or Namdi Azikiwe in Abuja free. A Frenchman who wants to travel to La Côte d'Ivoire does not need a visa. I need a visa. That is the reality of Africa. If I want to travel to South Africa today, the same thing. It is easier for an Australian, for a New Zealander, for a European to get into African countries than it is for Africans to travel to their neighboring countries. And that tells you that the post-colonial countries still think as if they were outposts of their colonizers. Only in the last week, you've seen the Burkinabe have been trying to stop the military, French military, from moving across the country into Niger. They tried to stone them in Bobo Dioulasso. They tried to stone them in Ouagadougou, but they are running through Burkina Faso as if Burkina Faso were a territory of France. You've seen the French Foreign Legion having a presence in Mali, in Guinea-Conakry, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Burkina Faso. So at the level of security, you can see how insecure we are. And these are the things that we must grapple with. And when we talk about resources, let us look at the economy of Africa today. Today, 90% of African trade is terminated in the currency of the United States of America, US dollars. Today, as I speak to you, there are 33 currencies operating in Africa. If I move out of Tanzania with the Tanzanian shilling and I cross over to Burundi, my Tanzanian shilling is useless. I need a dollar. When I move out of Angola with my Kwanzaa and I go to South Africa, my Kwanzaa is useless. I've got to use the rand. But an American moves from Boston in Massachusetts to any country in Africa, and we Africans are bowing and gesticulating for the almighty dollar. How can we as a continent grow if we find ourselves in that regard? If you go into the area of language, a friend of mine from Sweden once told me there is never in the history of mankind have a people known technological development in a language which is not their own. Hear me, I'm speaking in English, which is not my own. We speak in French, which is not our own. We speak in Portuguese, which is not our own. We speak in other languages, Spanish, which is not our own. We are going nowhere. Why? Look at Europe. The Europeans, you go to Sweden, they speak in their language and their goods are labeled in Swedish. Go to Little Norway, the same. Go to Italy, the same. Go to the Netherlands, the same. Go to Spain, the same. Go to Russia, the same. Go to the United States, which is a land of immigrants, English being dominant and Spanish threatening them, the same. Go to China, the same. Go to India, the same. Go to Vietnam, the same. Go to Japan, the same. Go to South Korea, the same. It is only Africa that describes herself as Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone. One of the things that we must now do, and I see the United Nations has now designated a day to celebrate Kiswahili, is to begin to ask ourselves the question whether we should give prominence to a few African languages and make them languages of science and art and commerce. These are things which the younger people have been talking about. You go into the area of mining. Look at the big miners in the continent of Africa, whether it's in gold or nickel or uranium or coal. There is not a single African company that one can talk about. All of them are foreign. Our diamonds are still cut in Antwerp, in Antwerp in Belgium, which produces not a single stone of diamond. Our gold is still traded in London and in Paris and New York. Our coffee is still converted, cocoa is still converted into chocolate in Switzerland, which does not have a single bush of cocoa. Men and women present in this forum, I know you are now wearing beautiful cologne, Hugo Boss, Versace, and all these, none of them, even perfume, we don't make. But if you look at the raw material, no, I know all of us are sometimes using our phones. Africa does not make even one. I know the Rwandese will claim that they have now assembled Mara, but it is not. So you can see we are so weak in every single sector. The young men and women who are making a presentation in agriculture, we have abandoned all our seeds, and now it is Monsanto and others who are telling us which seed to grow, our maize, our millet, and our sorghum. In other words, we are in a very, very weak position. And one can dare say that perhaps the problem of Africa has been overanalyzed. And perhaps the problems of Africa are now well understood. And perhaps what we should now be grappling with are the solutions. What can we do in order to make this situation better for these generations and generations yet to be born? And that is why, as I started at the very beginning, I was so touched with what I see as I travel across Africa that I said the African leaders must do something about it. And I think there is a problem in Africa. The problem of Africa is both a problem of leadership and followership. It is in Africa that we have leaders, and it doesn't matter whether we have gone to school or not. In fact, I dare say it is the Africans who have gone to school, who are called professors and doctors and engineers and lawyers, who are Africa's greatest problem. We are the greatest source of the problem of Africa because, number one, we have been tuned to think like Europeans, and we suffer from inferiority complex. And if you permit me to just demonstrate to you how sometimes it comes out, you find somebody who has gone to an African university, say the University of Lagos or the University of Cheikh Anta Diop, and has been there for a long time and has acquired his undergraduate, his bachelor's and his master's or PhD, he or she. And then when they go for a 6-month training to Yale or Harvard and Oxford, suddenly you see them when they are driving their cars, they have emblazoned thing, an alumni of Oxford, an alumni of Harvard, not Cheikh Anta Diop, not University of Lagos, no, but they only went to Oxford for 3 weeks for a course, half of which they did not attend. Inferiority complex. Inferiority complex. And I think that until we ourselves who have had the advantage of formal education unlearn some of the things that we ought to unlearn, then we will not go far. I'm reading a book which I commend to you. The title of the book is called African Culture in Governance and Development, The Ghanaian Paradigm. It's written by Nana Kobina Nketia, who is himself a professor of political science and indeed also a traditional ruler. And he cites a statement from Ngugi wa Thiong'o to underline our inferiority complex. I'll read it that you may understand. The South African apartheid system, the most highly developed repressive racist machine of Western monopoly capital, is, and I can now say was, rationalized biblically, derived religious doctrines of predetermination and the notion of the chosen people. So the African Christian, desirous of a place among the band of the saved, sang to his Mecca, "Wash me, Redeemer, and I shall be whiter than snow." If God was slow to respond, there were always hot combs and lipstick, snowfire and ambi to help the spiritual journey to whiteness and black death. That, in my view, captures part of the problem that we have in Africa, low self-esteem. And because I must conclude, aware as I am that the problem is known and has been properly worked, we must now ask ourselves, how can we resolve the problem? And I believe that the solution to the problem lies in going back to the basics. And what are the basics? The basics is, first of all, recognizing our identity. Many writers have talked about the African identity. The beauty of Africa is her heterogeneity, the fact that we are a diverse people. So that in Nigeria, for example, I've always thought it is possible to celebrate one being an Igbo without excluding the Igbo. It is possible to celebrate an Igbo without excluding the Yoruba. It is possible to celebrate the Yoruba without excluding the Ibibio. It is possible to celebrate the Fulani without excluding the Hausa. And we emphasize the things that unite us rather than the things that divide us. So that if we insist on centralism, which does not recognize these diversities, then the African nation as you know them, African nations as you know them today will collapse, all of them, because people are going to go back in a very atavistic way to their identities of the tribe. And you already see it. You see it in Nigeria, the Oduduwa Republic. You see it in Igbo. You see Hausa Fulani. You see it in Ethiopia right now, complete with a war, where the Tigray are emphasizing their Tigray identity. The Oromo are emphasizing the Oromo identity. The Amhara are emphasizing the Amhara identity. You go to South Sudan, you see the Nuer are emphasizing their Nuer identity. The Dinka emphasizing their Dinka identity. You go to Sudan, it is the same thing. You go to the Cameroons, they are emphasizing their English speakingness. And I'm suggesting that we must go back to the basics. And one of the practical ways in which we can do it today is to look at the question of governance. And that is why I think regional bodies such as ECOWAS, regional bodies such as SADC, East African Community, the Maghreb, the Central Africa, ought to move a little closer. In East Africa, for example, I know we said that we would have a common market, we would have a common customs union, you would have a monetary union, and ultimately we will have political federation. Within the context, if you move out of the regions, I think under the aegis of the African Union, we should also encourage free movement of people, because when people trade, you begin to de-emphasize the borders, so that somebody who is in Togo has the ability to move his or her goods to Ghana, and somebody who is in Ghana has the ability to move goods to La Côte d'Ivoire, and somebody who is in the Democratic Republic of Congo can do the same to Zambia, and somebody in Zambia to Malawi. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, if implemented in a proper way, does provide us with an opportunity of moving in that direction through trade. Secondly, movement of people. One of the things that we should work on is to eliminate these boundaries, these borders in terms of day-to-day administration. They are there for purposes of administration, but I see no reason why a Nigerian should not just wake up in the morning and take a plane and be in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, in China or in Russia with 12, I know it is a single country, with 11 time zones. One can move from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok 9 hours later. How can you compete with those? Look even at the area of mobile telephony. I'm in Kenya. My telephone code is 254. When I move to Uganda, I'm now in a foreign country with 256. When I move in the neighborhood in Tanzania, I'm now in 255. 54 telephone codes. How can you compete with China? How can you compete with the United States, whether from Boston's Massachusetts to Los Angeles, 5 hours flight, you are using one telephone, and yet you and me who are present here, some of us, are the ones who are quick to say, I'm Nigerian. And that then is very important. I'm Ghanaian. Then that is very important. Exclude, I'm South African, therefore Zimbabweans must go. I'm Namibian, therefore Angolans must go. How does it help you? It will only help in the process of expediting our recolonization by China and the West. And you can now see many things are beginning to happen. Britain is beginning to look to our former colonies. The French are very active in Africa. The Chinese are active in Africa. The Americans are active in Africa. The Indians are active in Africa. The Arabs are active in Africa. The Turks are active in Africa. There is a new scramble for Africa, if you did not know. There is a new one. And if we are not careful, you and me in our lifetime will see recolonization of a very subtle kind. You'll have black faces as presidents and as ministers riding in big cars, but the control levers will be in Beijing and in Germany and in other parts of the world. So I'm saying that in order to do this, I've already talked about the African Continental Free Trade Area. I've talked about free movement of people, and I'm also talking about education. We've got to look at education. What kind of education are we offering to our young men and women? We've got to look at value addition to our resources. In one of the footages that you showed, look at how our forests are being decimated, and who are destroying our forests in the Democratic Republic of Congo is China, is the Malaysians and others. Our seeds in agriculture, we must be able to feed ourselves. In the health sector, we must be able to make our own vaccines. Today, African countries are celebrating when they use possibly expired Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and AstraZeneca when they are received at the airport, because we have no ability to determine whether they are expired. Tell me, which African country, aside from Morocco and South Africa, can actually test the vaccines and determine whether they expired? Tell me. Even the doctors who are here, We are incapable. Our bureaus of standardization don't have the capacity to test. We are only receiving them gleefully. In other words, we must deal with our health sector. I could say more and more, but I believe that the purpose of this conversation is simply to tease out some of the issues that should be on the table and which you are familiar with, so that we can engage with them not only now, but at a later date. But it tells you, and this is what I want to conclude with, that Africa finds herself at crossroads. I think in my own lifetime, this is the worst that one can, that I see of Africa in all sectors. The continent is not at ease. And we have a duty, all of us, to have all our hands on deck if Africa is to be saved from the rapacious intervention of foreign powers. And I said, remember I said, that we have a problem of leadership and followership. We who are followers, and I look at a number of forums in which I belong, which are Pan-African, and you see how people are insulting each other. You see how the ethnic element comes out in debates. People abuse each other, abuse people that they do not know because they support this or this in their home countries. We cannot change if we don't look at all those things. And ladies and gentlemen, I am happy that Lead Africa is trying to bring minds together with a view to finding solutions to the African problems. Let us remember only one thing. The solutions we are seeking may not happen in our lifetime. So let us think intergenerationally. Even if we don't succeed now, our joy should lie in the recognition that we are empowering generations to come. Let me conclude there. I've spoken rather eclectically because I thought that that was the best way to really wrap my mind around many things which have been thrown on the table. Thank you very much, Faith, and all the participants, and I wish you the best of engagements.